Thank you to the panel for such interesting debate or conversation, and obviously a very powerful film there, so thank you for that. I'm Salah Said, I'm the Chief Exec at the Disasters Emergency Committee. It's an umbrella body that brings together 13 humanitarian organisations during major emergencies. We launched an appeal for the Nepal earthquake, raised £87 million, which was distributed through our member agencies, one of them's CARE. And we've got a proud history of collaboration here in the UK in terms of fundraising at a time where traditionally organisations compete with each other. But I'm always continuously actually surprised at the level or of collaboration in the field level. I think most of our member agencies put their faith in the coordination mechanisms, whether they be UN or government and so forth. And most also do prepare and invest a lot of time in disaster preparedness and risk reduction, but always tends to be at an operational level in the areas they would work. And I found the film so powerful in stepping out a little bit and telling the story about, well, why isn't there more collaboration between agencies, so that they're doing the disaster preparedness and risk reduction about how can we work together. I know there's great history. I mean, Handicap and CARE do have great histories of partnerships. But I think this is a powerful tool to try to encourage agencies to take a step back and say, despite what governments do and despite what UN cluster systems do, so there's an obligation on all of us to partner up before these events happen and get some action plans in place to actually collaborate. We all know we will have our specialities, but sadly it's not happening. So thanks for, I think, just helping us to reflect on that, and hopefully some strong action will come out of that. Thank you. Sorry, it's more of a statement than a question.
No, there was a question there. Thanks, Salah. Go ahead, yes.
Hi, I'm Mark Galloway. I'm Director of the International Broadcasting Trust. I'm a documentary filmmaker by profession, so I'm a great advocate of storytelling. However, I want to add a little bit of grit to this discussion, because several of the panelists have said, Christina, you said in your introduction, this film is telling us things that we already know, that we're familiar with. I think, Laurie, you said it reminds us, and you said things that you already know, and Alima said this is good for retaining knowledge. So if this is kind of telling us things that we already know, I mean, who is the target audience, and why does this particular film, which is a very, very well made but quite an old-fashioned documentary, why should this suddenly have impact when all the reports that you've talked about haven't had impact? I'm not quite getting why this is a vehicle for change, which you would like it to be.
Let me just take one more. That's probably the $65 million question there. Yes, go ahead in the back.
Thank you. I'm Nimesh Tungana. I'm originally from Nepal. I don't know if there's anyone here from Nepal other than Seetal, who is joining us virtually. But I'm a PhD student at LSE, and I'm actually focusing on the topic of earthquake response following the earthquake in 2015. And my question also builds on sort of just going through this documentary. It's, to me, I just came back from my field work in Nepal, and then there are a lot of dissatisfaction that still lingers from the earthquake. And in development and humanitarian sector, we talk a lot about, you mentioned about outcomes and effects and the effectiveness of the program. But just looking at this, it almost, to me, it is sort of we are celebrating this great response that took place after the earthquake, and not to undermine the great effort that the people put on the ground and the front responder. But I mean, when you're talking about lessons, is it all we have from the ground, or are there actually the issues about the failures that actually took place in the field? And if so, are you Steve, you mentioned this is just a series of things that you are planning to do, and maybe hopefully that will come out in the future. But to me, you said the focus has to be on the delivery system, because that's where we invest on. And but I would have expected, that's where I came from, to listen to the voices of the people actually who were in the ground and who actually actually in the movie there are some people who are shown, but their voices are actually being represented by the front responders, almost in that 92-year-old woman that you show in the movie. Is what you narrate on the movie, is that what the old woman was saying in that movie? And so it's actually basically, where's the critical voice here? Isn't this something that we already know, or something that we already celebrated and kind of?
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll come back to the panel now with those three questions. We have a question about why isn't there more collaboration at the field level, where we see so much going into coordination systems at the global level? A second question about why is this, if this is telling us things that we already know, why is this film going to have more impact than the things that have gone before it? And thirdly, you focused here, Steve, on the delivery system and why not the voices of the affected people. Where are the critical voices, and where will there be more? So maybe I will give you the privilege of answering those first as the director. Go ahead, Steve.
So the concentrate, I find that through years of journalism, journalists tend to gravitate towards what known as the beneficiaries, the victims, and tell their stories and tell that story of need. And that's the main channel of fundraising information. So I do think that story is told, and what we rarely see is this story of the people who are the delivery system. They are. I wouldn't go as far as to say that they're hidden. But you'll see you'll see a quick interview with one of the country directors or something. Sarah Blinn was constantly on the television throughout the earthquake. Who's the audience? The audience the audience for this was primarily the coalition. Now it's very interesting that when I was in the village with the Sheetal, I gave one of the old ladies my card. And she said, "That feels very nice, but I can't see it." And she had cataracts. And also with me was Rajmi Dangle from Pale Page. And just a couple of valleys away, still in Kaveri district, they had a cataract program going on for old people. And nobody was linking those ideas together. And the collaboration, there is collaboration taking place, but one of the interesting things that I found was, so among these coalition members, there is collaboration at the CEO level, at the executive level, and during the earthquake, also during this the situation in Haiti recently. They get together and they do collaborate. They collaborate on fundraising, they collaborate on sharing resources where they can, and this kind of thing. Why wasn't it happening on the ground among these organizations? Why didn't they know each other? And a part of that, I think, is the localization of leadership. One of the CEOs said to me that in his experience in the field, there was, everybody knew one another. But he was talking about a different era. He was talking about 20 years ago, when most of that leadership would have been expats, and they no longer are. The people who are leading the organisations. So Sarah Blinn was the only one I interviewed who was that was the only organisation that had an expat as the country director, and so the people who are leading the organisations on a country level now are bringing with them their own networks. And yes, they'll partner with those networks, but these will be, they'll often be people they went to school with, who they come from the same village as. They're building the networks just the same way as we build the networks. They're people we know, people we trust, and so, and that doesn't connect those organisations that we were dealing with. And so, back to that point that the audience is these other coalition organisations, because these are top-level organisations, and when they're working in the same place, they have a lot to give to each other, and they also have a lot that they can gain from the others. That was the point of it, and it wasn't it wasn't really intended initially for a broader audience. One more thing on, so during that disaster phase, things went reasonably. People tried hard, they worked hard, and they did their very best. The great failing in Nepal right now is not about disaster relief, it's about reconstruction. Now, in Kathmandu, there are still people living in displaced persons camps. They're still living in the mud. They wash on under outside water taps. Now, one of the things that we steered away from with this film was criticism of the government of Nepal. But there's a lot of it to go around. Bhaktapur, which is, as you know, so this is a UNESCO site. The contract for rebuilding, for reconstructing Bhaktapur has gone to guys who basically pour concrete. Now, this isn't something I discovered on the ground. This is from other research. When the people who built those buildings, the people who built those temples, have passed on their skills from generation to generation to generation, but you know what? They don't get a look in. So what are they going to end up with? These temples being reconstructed out of concrete, when you have the craftsmen there to do the reconstruction. And so there are a lot of political problems going on in Nepal that these agencies are. Don't forget that they're there at the invitation of the government, and they have to maintain a stance that maintains government legitimacy. And that's I don't have any expertise in that, but I see a lot of it. I've seen a lot of it over the years. It's not, where does the fault lie? I would say that the people with the most leverage on this are the donors. They're the ones with the money, they're the ones with the clout, they're the ones who can bang heads on walls. And whether that's happening or not, I don't know. So that's,
Steve, how is this film going to change that? How is it going to change the minds of the donors?
I think that certainly, as far as collaboration is concerned, so this is also partly one of the things I'm talking about with the CEOs. What's the relationship between collaboration and donors? And one of the things is the attachment to metrics. There's a very narrow focus on what it is that a grant is given for, and perhaps that should be loosened up a wee bit. Which is not to say it should be abandoned altogether, but that perhaps it should be loosened up a bit. But that's still an exploration, and so far I'm finding most people are making that comment.
Okay, good, thank you. Shital, while we have you online, did you want to respond to any of the questions? We had one on collaboration at field level, one on what is this film going to change if it's telling us things we already know. And also, we should be hearing a little bit more from critical voices from people and not so much from responders. Do you have any reflections on any of that? Shital, are you still there? Okay, maybe I'll move down the line here to see if Laurie wants to respond, and we'll come back to you.
Yeah, well, someone who wasn't involved in making the film and is really a viewer of it as well, but working in the same area, I think actually at one stage, and Steve referred to it earlier, I had the same question as this is the story of the aid workers, not of the people. But I think, as Steve has said, in a sense that was the audience, and it's okay for there to be a film that's for that audience. And if it's about getting people like that to work with each other, then it probably is pretty useful for them to be talking to each other through the medium of this film. And I don't think we can expect this film to solve everything, but I think if it can, by helping organisations understand each other's story, think about how they collaborate with each other, then it can make a contribution to that. We had an interesting conversation before we came in about your question about what about the problems. It doesn't really show the problems. And Steve, with his experience of filmmaking, was explaining to us one of the problems is when you go back and ask people a long time afterwards, they tend to remember the kind of high points, what's worked, why they're proud of what they've done. And he was explaining that another initiative that they have planning, and I think this is something that other NGOs are thinking about. How do we use technology to be filming more as we're doing things? That if you can do more of that real-time stuff with various kinds of technology, body cams and other things, that actually you'll kind of record something that's even more unvarnished, which you'll be able to kind of use to remember and review afterwards for more of those lessons too, and be a little bit less affected by the natural kind of psychological filters that maybe we have in when you're remembering. And I think that is a really interesting thing for all of us, over and within this coalition of NGOs and beyond, to use some of that technology to be remembering things and recording things when we're kind of so busy doing stuff that naturally maybe we're not recording as much as we could. I think that could be an interesting evolution in the future.
Okay, great. Alima, did you want to focus?
Maybe pick up on Salah's not question comment on collaboration. I think one of the things that I've reflected on in the last few years is, like many others, you collaborate, you have conversations with colleagues in London or Brussels or wherever. What does that actually mean in a country context? And I think one of the things that we've really recognized as an organisation is the best collaboration is that which is organic. And you may or may not have a relationship at a global level, but actually it's about these conversations you have in country, these relationships you build in country, which help you to collaborate better in the longer term. And I think about I know it's interesting that it didn't come up in the film, but we've been working with Operation Smile for many years, actually. And it didn't come up from either parties, which was interesting, not from us and not from them, and clearly Steve didn't pick up on it. But apparently we've been collaborating for many years because we work in one of the same districts. And it becomes a very localized conversation where we are collaborating simply because you're working in the same area, you've got complementary work, they do surgery, we provide rehabilitation, there's a natural fit. And in that particular context, it works. And so I think the best that we can do at the global level is to share information about perhaps a broader perspective of what other organizations that we network with are doing. And then we've kind of got to leave our field colleagues to try to build something from it. What we can do is share stories from one context to another. And one place where things have worked really well, I take the HelpAge example. We've in Nepal we worked together. Steve, you mentioned it. Doing advocacy within the cluster system for the inclusion of older people with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups in the disaster response. And that was a very localized solution, built by the two actors together, but also because both organizations knew that we'd done similar things in Haiti or in the Philippines or elsewhere. But ultimately, I think collaboration really does need to be driven, at least from our experience, the best collaborations we've had must be driven locally.
Thank you. Sheetal, did you want to come in on any of this? Are you still with us? No. Really bad. Okay, listen, if you can hear us, I hope you're enjoying the discussion. Maybe what I'll do is we have a question from our online audience, so I'll take that and I'll come back to the room if there's any further questions. I have a question here from Linda Poteet, an independent consultant, who would like to ask, as part of preparedness activities, were there regular simulations undertaken to test systems in place? If so, were development agencies and local NGOs included in these simulations? And perhaps you'd be the best person, Alima, to answer that. And maybe, Steve, if you observed anything in the filming. Go ahead.
I can try for the simulations. I can definitely talk about post-earthquake as well. Yes to both. Definitely simulations. Certainly the work that we did was with the Ministry of Health, so very much with the national health provider. And all the work we do in Nepal, which is the case for most organizations, I think, is with local partners. So we certainly worked with our local actors and did a lot of work. I remember actually 2 weeks before the earthquake going with the team in country to visit the national sort of the trauma center, the main hospital, and talking to the one of the surgeons there about the work that they'd been doing, that we've been supporting, about testing and trialing. I think it was a group of organizations working together, local, international, and the Ministry of Health at the teaching hospital. What is emergency triage setting look like? How do you set up a field site outside, because you know you're most likely going to have to evacuate your patients outside and or have to manage influx in the parking lot or in the park in the middle. So there was some simulation work done, and certainly with local actors. And interestingly, one of the things that we did quite quickly after the disaster, and that's in collaboration with the UK Emergency Medical Team, which is the British government's response to disasters, is taking that simulation work into the districts. So recognising, very quick learning from the earthquake is, well, the epicenter wasn't in Kathmandu, and the way that the country is set up, the roads network, the mountains, so on and so forth, is that you can't rely on people being brought to the capital, so you actually have to do these simulations outside. So that's certainly something that's been done with a number of actors, international, local, since as well.
Okay, thank you. Steve, I don't know if you encountered any stories like this during your filming, or if people had talked about some of the preparedness they had done ahead of the disaster.
Only handicap. Nobody else had thought about it. So they were it was lunchtime on a Saturday, and the earthquake happened, and these were people who were in the middle of the earthquake as well. That shouldn't be forgotten. An earthquake of that magnitude is kind of scary. I've been in about 4 earthquakes now. And they're all different, but I've never been in one that big. I've been about, I think it was 5.8 is about the highest I've been. And what do you do? I mean, your first instinct is to help yourself, isn't it? And those around you. Or as Rashmi did, just sit there for the rest of the day, because at the moment you're safe, and you don't know whether moving is gonna make you safer. And then Peter McGeechy says it as well, that the first thing that they needed to do was find out whether their staff were up to it. Were they able to recover sufficiently to actually go out and help other people? And by contrast, you have SOS Children's Villages who were in such a stable situation that the next morning they just went out. They took the kids out, the mothers went out, the kids went out, and they just helped people wherever they could. So it varied, but of course, Handicap International was, they just followed the protocols.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. We have. Did you want to respond at all, Laurie?
No, let's go. Take another question.
We have another question from our online audience, and it was actually something that I've been wondering and wanting to ask the panel as well. So it's great that it's not coming from me. Janet Crossley would like to ask: in light of the Charter for Change, commitments to enable more locally led responses, were there any lessons that came out during the discussions in filming about how to best work with local and national NGOs in disaster preparedness and coordination? So again, I think maybe I'll start with you, Steve, with regards to the filming, and then if you guys can come in based on your own experiences and what you saw in the film. Thank you.
All the organisations were using natural resources. Handicap with the physiotherapists, they sent out on social media. They just sent out a request for the physiotherapists to come in, and they responded, and they had an enormous response by the end of the day. With HelpAge, they needed to get in touch with the committees, or the associations, the older persons associations. So yeah, there was again, these were the networks. These were the local networks that had been that were they were connected. So Handicap International in Nepal is connected locally through through the same networks. People that they went to school with. Sunil Pokhrel, by the way, is he was educated in an SOS Children's Village. Which doesn't. I tried to bring it out in the film, but it just didn't work. So it really is all about. It's no different. To people from Harvard or Yale or Oxford or Cambridge getting together. Those are their networks, and the Nepalese networks are. They're pretty much the same. They're people that you know, and so yeah, They don't call them collaborations, they call them partnerships. And they're long-standing partnerships. The distribution of money by Help Age is with the older people's associations and the partnerships with very, very local, as in district, just the district level local organisations, Nepalese organisations.
Okay, thank you. Lima, local networks, local organizations, peer-to-peer. We saw a lot of that in the film. Was there anything that struck you as sort of some key ingredients from this experience for handicap?
I think absolutely a response is always going to be stronger when you've got local networks, but that can be local within your own organization or local with partners, and local has lots of different meanings. Do we mean local at the village level? Do we mean regional? Do we mean national? Do we district level? What do we actually mean by local? So I think we have to be really careful when we use the word local or localization. It can have lots of different meanings, and I think that's where it's really context specific. I think about Nepal. It's not a country I've worked in, it's a country I visited and obviously the organisation works in, but the impression I get from our colleagues is you've got a lot of organisations that were preparing for a long time for a disaster like this, and so you can really tap into a lot of local strengths. I compare that to some of the big disasters that I've responded to previously, where particularly when you're working in some of the, in the sector we work in with disability, you're often working with really small grassroots organisations who may not be anywhere near where a disaster happens, and their focus is so small that trying to then add in disaster response and assume that you can do a local response through your local partners, it doesn't always work. And I've had local partners say to me, that we've worked with for 10, 15 years, disaster strikes, and they actually don't know what to do. So then, they're asking for support of how can they do more next time, but they were actually not in a position potentially to respond in a disaster. So I think we definitely need to draw on local capacities, but it's not always going to look the same. And it needs to be context specific. I also think in a lot of disasters, they will, no matter how much we work and how much we need to focus on strengthening local response, there's always going to be a place for international organisations. That might be different from context to context. I mean, I look at Haiti, and it's interesting, I was talking to our team last week about that with the hurricane that's passed 2 weeks ago, and the government is in a much stronger position today than they were in 2010 when I was there, and in 2008 when I was there for the last massive hurricane, which is fantastic because the government's taking a much bigger role. But that's something, those things take time and their steps, and so I think there's always going to be a role for different organisations, and it's just figuring out how you fit within a response that needs to be the most contextually, locally appropriate response, whoever's providing that. Just quickly on the peer-to-peer that you've asked about, I think it's definitely one of the areas we really try to work on, and I think that's where Steve, you mentioned earlier, investing in the delivery system, not the beneficiaries. I feel like that's a very artificial divide. Because I think the best response is when you are working with the local population. And so, somebody who has lost a limb, like in the example in the film, and having them speak to somebody else who's just had injury actually can really, really make a huge impact on the individual, much stronger than any other part of the delivery system. So I think that's a really key strength, and that's where we need to think of an affected population as having lots of capacities and not just a need of support.
And one of the things that I was referencing there was the building of communities. So Heifer International essentially are dealing with, they build this community who are effectively beneficiaries, but the lines start to blur as to who is part of Heifer, who is part of Heifer International and who is a beneficiary, because they become self-sustaining. And Heifer International hardly ever goes out to that village. They don't need to. Those women have effectively taken control of their own lives. The empowerment has been left there for them, and they've picked it up and they've run with it. And Heifer does that all over the world, and so it's that line really does blur between who's a beneficiary and who isn't.
Laurie, I'm going to give you the last word on this one. Key ingredients for local response, and what is a role for an organization such as CARE in these things?
Well, I mean, I do think that the film showed how both that their, local people and local organisations were a big part of the response, and also that it needed to be a big part of the response. One of the things I think is interesting is that, and linking it to the previous question too, is that it really shows how preparedness is very much about the kind of soft side of preparedness, really. So, I mean, the example that Alima was giving about Help Handicap International of doing, the drills of actually thinking through what would happen in a situation. It's the planning, it's the people, it's the meetings, and all those kind of things. And then even the organisations that weren't necessarily planning for an emergency, because they were working with local communities, they were building that community capacity so that they were able to work with those communities were able to respond more when the emergency happened. What I think in a way all of this highlights is that the preparedness and the disaster risk reduction is very heavily focused on the soft side of what we can do, which is essentially the cheaper side of what we can do. The expensive stuff would have been, all of these buildings are made of brick. They're all going to kind of fall down in a river of bricks. What are we going to do in advance to stop that? And that's expensive. It gets traded off against, we're doing development programs to help people with the problem that they know they've got rather than the problem that they might have, and we can't afford to do both. And that is a real problem and a real issue.
Yeah, no, thank you. Those trade-offs, I think, are part and parcel to all of these discussions we've been having for a very long time about how to bridge those kind of shorter-term responses with the longer-term responses and preparedness in advance of all of that. So, listen, I wanted to thank all of you panelists for coming today and for relaying to us your experiences, both with the film and just in general in terms of your organizations. I thought it was a very interesting discussion and a very interesting film. Thank you. And thanks also to our audience here in the room and online. Thank you for your questions, for your interest, for coming. The film is online, and I hope you share it, you watch it. The hashtags are up here for this event, but also use them to share the film. The recording of this event will be made available on ODI's website in a few days' time. So if you need to refer back to that, it will be available to you. And now there's wine reception next door, so please help yourselves and get to know each other. Thanks very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.
Okay.